Welcome to Inside Tax Policy, and I'm joined here today at our Global Tax Symposium by Mike Williams, who is the Director of International and Business Tax at HM Treasury. Mike, welcome.
Thank you, Will.
Good.
Thank you for inviting me.
So two things that we want to talk about today. Digital, top of everybody's agenda, but also Brexit, which is a very important issue for American companies. But let's start with digital. We're not going to talk about the EU version, which seems to change day by day, and who knows exactly where it stands today, and even where it stands today, it probably won't stand tomorrow. But in the very recent UK budget, the UK announced an intention to introduce the DST. So can you tell us a little about that, maybe differentiate it from the EU version, but tell us a little about sort of the underlying theory behind it.
Yeah, I mean, the UK government has announced it will introduce a digital services tax from April 2020. The Chancellor announced that in his budget on the 29th of October. And it will cover revenues from search engines, social media platforms, and internet marketplaces. So quite narrowly targeted on what we see as the digital business models where there's most value created by user participation. Focusing on those activities and only focusing on the revenues from those activities. We're currently consulting on the details of that. Obviously, the key is to get the definitions right of the activities targeted. Why are we acting now? Well, we hope for a long-term solution that would involve changes to the profit allocation rules, possibly changes to the permanent establishment rules, or the deeming of a new sort of permanent establishment to cater for the change profit allocation. But that I fear is likely to be quite a while in coming, and the question therefore is not should we do nothing or should we wait for that. The question is should we do nothing or should we have an interim solution while we're waiting for that? And the government decided that it was appropriate to adopt an interim solution.
So obviously this, at least for the UK, is very much a tech company focused issue. Tell us a little about, sort of, as I say, the underlying theory. We hear the term active user participation bandied around. What do you understand that to mean?
I mean, maybe it's a tech company issue, but I think not all tech companies. Many tech companies do rather similar things to what people did in the past.
Right.
They sell phones. People used to sell phones in the past, just they work wirelessly now. Or people do things like cloud computing, but it's a form of storage, or they download digital content instead of you buying CDs. To us in those circumstances, you are still basically a consumer and you're paying for what you consume. I think if you contrast that with, say, social media platforms, where most of the content on those platforms, most of the reason why people go there is actually provided by other users or by the person who is actually looking at those, and they are playing a real role in the value created by those enterprises.
Right.
And that's also why those enterprises then, give them access for free in a sort of perpetual loss leader, which wouldn't exist unless there was some advantage from doing it.
Right. And it seems that these proposals, as with others, essentially indicate that the destination, if you will, the market, the place where that activity is taking place is not being sufficiently rewarded at the moment, at least in terms of profit allocation. We know in the OECD conversation from what we've heard that the US has an idea around marketing intangibles. We'll use that label. Obviously, there's the UK idea around active user participation. Both of those seem to look more to the destination country. As the OECD process moves forward, do you think there's the possibility of those ideas melding together, of taking sort of elements of both of those? I mean, because one is obviously very broad, one is very narrow, but they seem to have, in some senses, a similar focus.
I'm not convinced that the focus is that similar. I think some of the underlying mechanics that you would need to implement either of those proposals that you've just described are quite similar. You will be looking at the non-routine profit, I think, and having to divide that up between which countries you obviously would have to decide. I think, though, if you focus on marketing intangibles, you're looking at the whole market and you're looking at consumers and implicitly at consumption, which to us is moving onto the demand side of the equation. If you look at users and distinguish them from consumers, and we see a valid distinction that we have explained in the position papers that the government issued earlier this year and at the end of last year, we think what you're in effect doing is focusing on a new form of production, which involves the users as well as the workers. The workers are compensated by their salaries. The users are compensated by getting something for free forever.
Right. Good. this is a really interesting topic, and one that I know that we'll come back to, and hopefully if you come back in the summer, we can interview you again and see where things are going. But I want to move to the other topic, which unfortunately by the summer will have happened. We are almost exactly 4 months away from Brexit, from leaving the EU. There's a swirl of stories about what's going to happen. Obviously, this is a very delicate time in terms of what the Prime Minister's doing, taking it to Parliament, and all the rest of that. But could you talk to us a little about what the Treasury in particular has been doing? I mean, obviously there are some tax issues. They're not the top issues in terms of Brexit, but there are tax issues about the application of some of the directives, for example, about how other things work. But then more broadly, there's all around customs. And the implications as this spills over into actually seamless trade. Can you just tell us a little about what the Treasury and you have been doing in this area recently?
I mean, I think a key point is that the UK, and obviously with the Treasury's involvement, has reached a withdrawal agreement with the EU. Yeah. Under Article 50 of the EU Treaty, if you want to withdraw, then the normal way of doing that will be to reach a withdrawal agreement. That then has to be ratified by the European Parliament on the EU side, by the UK Parliament on the UK side, and that's a process that's now underway, which will take place in the next few weeks. In a sense, the proposition there is that it is important to have an orderly withdrawal in terms of the smooth running of the economy, the smooth running of people's lives, making it as little disruptive as you possibly can. So that, I mean, is the big picture. I think it's fair to say on what you might call the revenue side, most of the focus has been on customs because it's most visible. There's a sense in which perhaps that's slightly odd, because if you look at customs duties, we're talking in the UK about collecting £3 billion at the moment, whereas the VAT revenues are, say, 130, 140 billion pounds. So, massively swamping the customs duties. But, in reality, in the current configuration of customs, you're either in a free trade area with other countries, or you have customs borders and declarations, and it's all about managing that on the customs side. There's then quite a lot of work on VAT, because in a world where you have customs declarations, VAT generally on imports hangs off those customs declarations. That's not what happens currently in the EU single market, of which the UK is part, because there aren't customs declarations, so the VAT has to work differently. How do you then reconfigure that for a world in which we will be outside the EU? So that's an important aspect. Then, as you said, on the direct tax side, there are some EU directives. The Interest and Royalties Directive, there's a Parent Subsidiary Directive. If we look to the period when we leave the EU, if we assume that the withdrawal agreement applies and we move into what the UK government calls the implementation period, those agreements will continue to apply during that transition. Obviously, depending on what's agreed subsequently, they may well not apply after that transition.
And we know in some cases that there are things which will automatically turn off. I mean, there are provisions in treaties which say, if you're a member of the EU, then this happens. If you're not a member of the EU, then that happens. I'm not going to ask you to opine on that, but what I am going to say is, as Brexit happens, and as businesses come across these issues, will Treasury, will HMRC be open to talking to businesses, to trying to sort this out on an expedited basis?
Yeah, I mean, we've already had business raise those issues with us. We'd already identified, I think, most of the issues, and we are working with other countries to solve them. There's a sort of similar issue with quite a lot of the EU's free trade agreements, where there may be quotas. Well, how do you address a quota when the UK is no longer part of the EU? And obviously you can't do that just within the EU because there's a third country involved. So, I mean, we are concerned about those issues. I think it's probably fair to say that our treaty network with the other EU member states is perhaps in need of updating. We have given priority, perhaps understandably, to the treaties beyond the EU, because quite a lot of the relationships within the EU have been governed by directives or by the EU treaty. So we will need to address that.
Well, lots of work to do. We wish you well with that, and we obviously hope that everything goes smoothly. But Mike, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for joining us on Inside Tax Policy.